All right. Fact check this podcast and back with Mark. We're picking back up on history they didn't teach in school. Last time we did this, we talked about Richard Nixon, which was actually a great conversation and has come up at least half a dozen times just for me, like in conversations with normal people. Like somehow Nixon will get brought up, especially in reference to the things that have happened with Biden and Harris and then Trump picking J.D. Vance as his vice president. The Agnew stuff and the Gerald Ford stuff becomes very important when looking at Nixon. And so with things that are happening currently, it ties back into Nixon and some of the stuff that happened then. So it's made for interesting conversations and gotten to reference some of that stuff. The last history type show that I did was with Pete a couple weekends ago, where we talked about the aftermath of World War I, which the lead up to World War I is insane and actually overlaps some of timelines and stuff that we're going to be looking at tonight. But then the aftermath of World War I kind of sets the stage for literally the world we live in today and all of the bullshit that we get to deal with in modern times. But tonight we will dial it back a little bit further, and we will be talking about Napoleon. And
is there a rhyme or reason to the time periods we're covering? I mean, we got the 20th century, middle of the 20th century with Nixon, and then before that, we're just going backwards a little bit to the time period leading up to World War I, and then we bounce back 100 years here to Napoleon. There's no rhyme, is there?
There is reason. The rhyme might not be a rhyme, but there is a reason. So I feel like going back to, literally to the founding of the United States is where you can kind of begin the unraveling of society as a whole for what we see now. I think that was kind of a major pendulum swing point in history when the United States won its revolution against England. That kind of broke a power structure and established this new thing. Not necessarily new per se, but to this point, not tested at the level that it was about to be. And then as that continued to grow and expand, then you start to see a lot of the European revolutions that happen, where governments get toppled, things get changed really across the world. This also coincides with a rise of communism and other isms like democracy, all sorts of new things that overturn what had been the traditional power structure of really the planet for 2,000 years. Now it starts to get flipped on its head. And some of the figures and stuff we're talking about are, I think, big turning points that, like the post-World War I and the things that were done to Germany post-World War I. The whole thing with Nixon and the way he was removed when he had the audacity to not continue to be a globalist puppet. These are important steps in how we end up where we are now. So yeah, there might not be necessarily a rhyme to it, but there is a reason to it. Where do you want? So your
revolution is a good segue, because the American Revolution is always compared side by side with the French Revolution. Napoleon was a, quote, son of the revolution, and then when he became first consul and then emperor, he declared himself to be the revolution. Obviously, we got to go back a little bit further to sort of set up the scene there, but just a little bit about the French Revolution versus the American Revolution. Obviously, this was debated at the time in the colonies after they had declared their independence and won their independence from England, over whether the new American government should support the French Revolution in the spirit of their own 1776 revolution. The famous side by side was obviously Hamilton versus Jefferson. Jefferson was more friendly to the French. Hamilton more friendly to the sort of the established powers, the established monarchy in French, because Hamilton was a monarchy respecter himself, and Jefferson was more of the how would you describe Jefferson's mindset with regard to the revolutionary spirit? And this is getting into the weeds a little bit. We should do an episode on the whole battle between Jefferson and Hamilton sometime.
Jefferson was a little more, it sounds wrong to say it this way now, but he was a little more New World Order-y, like taking power back from the established figureheads and to a large extent giving it back to the people to an extent. Like, he wrote the Declaration. He was a big part of like all of the amendments, the Bill of Rights, everything else. Like, he understood what it would take for a people to govern themselves in a reasonable, reliable, and effective manner. And seeing the tyranny of kings and emperors and so on, I think he thought that there was a better way to do it. So that would be a good, like,
Jefferson was for the common man, and Hamilton was for the aristocracy, or building up a new aristocracy, which was his desire in the colonies after declaring independence. So the French Revolution is not viewed as a positive light by those who appreciate the American Revolution, even at its time. Edmund Burke, the conservative English writer, wrote fondly of the American Revolution, and I wrote a whole book on basically destroying the French Revolution. But that's not to say, and I'm not like a big fan of the French Revolution either. There's a lot that was wrong with it. But I will say, there were probably some legitimate grievances as well. And one of Napoleon's issues as he was growing up and witnessing this and being a young officer in the military was, in fact, that King Louis XVI was a weak king, was fat, lazy, and was resting on his laurels. And this had maybe been occurring even before he took over the throne. And it's understandable for someone who desires power, who appreciates power, to see those in power just not effective in it at all. And so when the revolution arose, like, King Louis was kind of, it was basically just a stump on the log. So this is so Napoleon's relation to, like, the French Revolution harkens back to where he was born. He was born in Corsica, which is an island that's sort of in between coasts of France and Italy. But he was actually more Italian in manner than French at the time, though Corsica was a territory of France, not of Italy. It had more influence from Italy, or he had more Italian influence in his family. He was born on this island, and it is actually the year that he was born was the year that France actually formalized its taking over of it. Interestingly enough, his father, Napoleon's father, initially was sort of on the side of the Corsican rebels who wanted to essentially establish this island as an independent nation and not one under the rule of France. But when France came in with their armies to ensure that this was squashed, his dad quickly reverted to the side of the French without much of a fight at all. And later on, Napoleon would express disappointment in his dad, even though Napoleon would become the greatest citizen in France, right? That his dad didn't fight on the side of the Corsicans and maintain or win their independence from France, the country he would eventually become emperor over. It kind of reminds me of like that maybe this is never really stated, or I've never really read this, but perhaps part of his greatness was sort of that inability in his dad to sort of win a legacy over for himself. Sort of this like inner disappointment that he himself like had to strive to make good or whatever. And it reminds me of Teddy Roosevelt's father. Teddy Roosevelt's father was a Northerner during the Civil War. His mother was the war between the states. I'm sorry, was a Northerner. his mother was a Southerner. She was very sympathetic to the Southern cause, but his dad did not end up fighting in the war, even though he was of age to, because he was rich enough to pay someone to fight for him. I forget what those were called. It was some sort of service back in the day when you could
Yankee fucking pussies.
So Teddy Roosevelt, a man's man who never backed down from a fight, had a dad who definitely backed down from a fight. This probably had part of the reason to do with his own legacy and the one that he kind of created for himself. So Napoleon was born in France, or born of French blood, or born in French territory. Had a lot of Italian blood. Didn't necessarily love his country or love the country that he was born into. He wasn't raised to. As a boy, he was eventually sent to the mainland of France to go to school there, to one of the noble schools there, and they actually had to confirm that there was noble blood in his family name, which is something that his father went about doing, was able to confirm, because in order to be entered into one of these noble schools, you had to have that in your lineage, which sort of gives us a glimpse into Napoleon's sort of restlessness or his in-betweenness when it comes to the French Revolution, because though he was technically of noble blood and that was able to be confirmed and got him sent to this school, he didn't feel of noble blood because his family wasn't rich. They weren't well-to-do. They didn't really have a name that was known. And so when he was in this school, he was the poorest boy, didn't have money to sort of do anything, only was able to focus on studies, wasn't popular, all this stuff. So when he's sort of growing up in this, he goes to a couple of different schools. At first, he goes to a Catholic school where they're trained to be like priests and monks and whatnot, which is strange. It's strange to look back now that Napoleon could have been a monk, or not a monk, a priest, which one of his brothers was eventually. I don't even know what the word is. Not canonized. He became something in the Catholic Church. And Napoleon eventually moved on to a military school where he actually wasn't like a genius student, but he was one of the hardest working students, which would eventually become one of his geniuses, in that he like never stopped, just constantly go, had like all the energy in the world.
I wonder if Napoleon was like Stalin, who, when he went to visit his mother before she passed, she said he would have done better if he had been a priest.
Maybe his relationship with his mom is interesting, because she would actually outlive Napoleon. And throughout his entire rise, and while he was at the peak of his powers, she would constantly just repeat that, well, this is fleeting. It could go away at any time. I mean, eventually it did. It was a pretty abrupt end for him. So she never really like took for granted the power that he achieved. I mean, she definitely lived a better life. For the longest time, she did stay on Corsica until eventually he moved her mainland, or they moved mainland. Military school. He eventually gets to fight in some battles and wins the respect of his elders, or of his superiors. The revolution starts to heat up. He's periodically back and forth between Corsica and Paris, where everything's sort of the hottest as far as the revolution goes. He's sympathetic with the revolutionaries, as I said, because even though he is, quote, of noble birth, he doesn't feel like he is. He's not lived a life that kind of like would display that he is. And he believes that, sorry, Jay Forte just distracted me. This is a reference to the movie, which we can talk about the issues of the movie as we go on. Did you watch the movie?
No, you said you didn't recommend it, and I put it on like one of those like back burner. Okay, I'll get to this like after I watch some other stuff, and then I kept adding other stuff in front of it, and it's still sitting about like 6th on the list of like whenever I get through the other stuff, then I'll get to it. But I also keep adding other stuff in front of it. It and Oppenheimer are currently sitting at about the same spot. It's like I'll watch Oppenheimer one of these days, but it's probably not going to be anytime super soon. Same for the Napoleon movie. I was really excited about it initially, and then I didn't hear great things, and I was like, yeah, well, I'll get to it when I get to it, and that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, I would almost recommend Oppenheimer over Napoleon, but I don't have to think about that one. It's super long. So he's sympathetic with the revolution, with the revolutionaries, but there's also factions in the revolution as well. I mean, you have like the real radicals, which are like the Jacobins, and there are others who the Republicans who just sort of want to set up their own Republican government, kind of modeled after what they're seeing happening in the States. And Napoleon sort of goes more with the Republicans because he thinks the radicals are a little nuts, and his main thing is equality, which sounds super gay, but equality in that time meant more so anyone could rise to any level of power, as opposed like a meritocracy, basically, as opposed to like when you think of the word equality today and all of the sort of gay stuff that goes along with that.
We're talking about Jeffersonian equality for rich white men, not equality for like all the other like lesser thans.
Yeah. So this was Napoleon's sort of driving force, but he also, as he spends time in Paris and witnesses the events of the mob, he grows to hate the mob, and he can't stand this sort of mentality, this take-all mentality of the revolution, where it's kind of like what we see today, even like with folks begging for their rights. And what their rights means is basically they are begging for the state to supply everything that they do in life, or supply their status and their livelihood and everything. And this is not something that Napoleon is necessarily fond of. But then on the other side of the coin, as I mentioned earlier, he loathes the weakness that he sees in the monarchy, in Louis the 16th, and then also even in the Directory, the provisional government that's set up once the monarchy has finally been sort of squashed. He rises up the ranks in the military under the provisional government, under the Directory, which it's kind of hard to say how even like government was provided in this time period. With this always happens like in the 1790s, like super like quickly, and they keep changing directories and governments, and there are different provisional governments. And it's
like you said earlier, like there was the American Revolution that was kind of executed relatively well, and then you have the French Revolution that is executed very poorly. There doesn't seem to be it's almost like they didn't think they would ever win. Like,
yeah,
you have to have a game plan for what you do if you win. Like, okay, if we win, these are the steps we take to make sure that this thing fucking sticks and we do it right. And the French Revolution, it's almost like they they didn't actually know what to do if they actually won. It was like, oh shit, we won. Now what?
It is the dog chasing the car. Like, what's the dog going to do when he finally catches the car? But they can't really figure it out. And it is straight up anarchy in the sense of, in like sort of the traditional sense of that term, where there are no, even when there are rulers, there are no rulers. Just everyone, well, not even everyone for himself. I mean, there's still like the men with the guns still have the power in the situation, and the peasants still kind of aren't any better off than they were under the monarchy. Napoleon is able to rise through the military ranks during this time. And I need to cough, so I'm going to mute myself.
Have at it. Mark, for those who aren't aware, has been sick for like the past week, which is why he's available, because he's so sick he doesn't have to work or spend time with a girlfriend or anything like that. He can just sit in his room, drink water, and talk to me. That's how special I am. Is I get Mark's undivided attention as long as he's sick and has nothing better to do.
Yeah, I do have the AIDS 19, in case anyone was wondering. Dang.
I'm not saying anything about that because I'm trying to keep this a clean stream that stays up on YouTube. So people who actually want to learn about Napoleon can
there we go.
check that out.
Oh yeah, monkeypox as well, Jay Forte. So there comes a time in the Revolution after Napoleon has rise to the ranks in the military where there are these three separate factions called the Sectionaires. And they're sort of what we covered earlier. We have the Republicans who want a more Republican form of government. You have the Jacobins who, really express what form of government they want. They're just the radicals who like chaos. You could call them communists before communism was really a thing. And then there are also folks who even wanted to reestablish the monarchy, even though it had literally just been toppled months before.
I feel like if there was an American Revolution 2.0, as soon as it was over, if the whole thing got stripped down, you would have those same people that would be like, all right, so now that we're done with all that, can we just put it back together now? Like,
yeah, definitely.
And to be fair, after the American Revolution, you also had people in America who were on that same kind of a boat. It's like, all right, we won, like we proved our point. Now can we like rejoin the British Empire? Like we did a great job. Like they get it. We're serious. So now we go back, right? Like we're not actually like doing this. Like,
and it was pretty messy after American Revolution too, because you had initially the Articles of Confederation for 13 years in between the constitutional coup, as some might want to call it. So it's regime change is always messy. These three sectionaires are essentially threatening violence towards the Directory at the time. Napoleon actually comments to one of his fellow officers in the army. He's like, if the sectionaires put me at the head of all three of them, like I could take out the Directory in no time and we could establish something from there. Ironically enough, it is the Directory who asks for Napoleon's help in defense against the sectionaires, which he accepts because Napoleon, as I've sort of laid out, is kind of a chameleon. Like he's going to do what's going to lift up his own status. No matter, he maybe expresses that he wants to be the head of the sectionaires, but if they're not the first ones to ask, then he'll just join the Directory and help them out, which he does. Fires upon the sectionaires, kills some people.
Something to be learned for those who don't understand how power works. If you are actually somebody who's interested in power, you claim power however power is offered to you. Like you can't be a sycophantic purist of morality or whatever. Like if you see that you have an opportunity to rise to power and to take it, you take it where it's offered. And like Napoleon is very opportunistic in that, in a lot of that, like not just here, but throughout his military career, Napoleon is very opportunistic in being able to identify and capitalize on, this is how I win. And at the end of the day, in these types of situations, in civil unrest and in regime change and in everything kind of hitting the fan, winning is the number one thing. Everything else comes secondarily after you win. Like, once you win, now you can figure out all that other bullshit. But first, you have to win.
So Napoleon wins. He takes down the sectionnaire protest, which essentially brings him to the top of the French army. There are some successful military campaigns after this, and some unsuccessful in a way. Like his campaign in Egypt, he sort of loses the respect of some of his men. He kind of deserts them, but somehow he's always able to revive that respect. He returns to France, and if things still aren't going well, nobody's content with this directory government. The people want a constitution. Napoleon, even though he sort of lost respect during some campaign failures in Egypt, still has the government, or still has the army completely on his side. And so he tries to enact a military coup, essentially. This is like 1799, and his brother is part of the Congress. One of his brothers is part of one of their parliament at the time, whatever it was called, Council of 500, I believe, or he's associated with it in some way. And he helps Napoleon enact a really sloppy coup. You got to like read over the details. It's kind of confusing how things go down. Napoleon is threatened to be trampled on by like the council, by the parliament, by the Council of 500. His brother is actually more politically savvy than him, and is able to sort of convince them to set up a consulship in which Napoleon is one of 3 consuls, but he's like the first consul. Which is interesting because there's a Caesar parallel here, because Caesar was obviously consul before he became Caesar. I didn't know if you wanted to catch that or not. And he's essentially first consul for 4 years. And here's where he becomes really active in government. Is able to set up like the Napoleonic legal code. He's doing a lot of the things that the peasants or the common folk of France were essentially asking for during the revolution, where he's sort of bestowing greater land rights to them. He's taken down sort of the aristocracy of the time, like the rules that had been set in place for many years that sort of didn't allow any sort of upward mobility for the peasants or the lower classes of France, and become super popular. And this leads to him eventually convincing to be named the emperor for life, consul for life, initially, and then essentially emperor through his popular will. And it's at this time that he names himself the Revolution. He is even crowned by the Pope. And we've heard the famous, you tell the famous crown joke while I take a drink. You know the line, right?
No.
Oh, my goodness. He found the crown of France lying in the gutter, and he simply picked it up, is the line.
I hadn't heard that.
That's a famous Napoleon line. Interestingly, when the Pope comes and essentially places the crown, well, gives over the crown to him, it was custom for popes to place the crown on top of kings' heads, because this shows that king had divine right, or maintained divine right. Napoleon took the crown from the Pope and placed it on his own head. In contrast, because this was to show that his was not a divine right kingship, but one of the people, because he rose from the ranks of the people.
Interesting.
And he becomes Emperor of France. But even though he does establish a lot of like progressive government reforms in France and is really active in this way, his love is always the battlefield.
I was going to say, this is where give you an opportunity to take a drink and catch your breath. This is where Napoleon will start to deviate from other rulers, monarchs, emperor types, in that he is a general first and a politician second, if even second. Like, his love is for the battlefield, not for the political field. And so he continues to a large extent, be a successful military presence for a while, until he's not. But there's a lot that happens during that time too.
Yeah. He also, during the time, I think before or during his time as consulship, he does marry Josephine, whose husband was part of the past aristocracy. And she has children of her own, and he is really bent on, once he becomes emperor especially, bent on creating an heir, which he's unable to do with Josephine, which eventually leads later down in their marriage to eventually get a divorce, because she doesn't produce him a son, or any child for that matter. This is an aside, but the movie that came out basically credits Josephine with all of Napoleon's successes because of some certain like angst he has regarding her, and his love for her, and his like desire to seek her approval. Initially in his career, especially while he's away on military campaigns, she is like not faithful to him at all. And they do have like a weird relationship, and like it's displayed in the movie. But to like sort of base all of his success on the weirdness of the relationship is stupid. And I mean, and it's he did have a lot of affection for her, even though she wasn't able to bear him the son that he wanted. So that's not to discount the relationship that he had with Josephine. And he still had, like, it was tough for him down the road to even like go through with the divorce because of the closeness of the relationship. But Napoleon, ever the opportunist, was also ready to figure out a way to find a son to get himself a son.
They had a strong relationship, if not a particularly or maybe necessarily good one. So it was he was about his power and his legacy more so than about some weird idealization of the relationship kind of a thing.
Yeah. So Napoleon's ultimate desire with all of his military campaigns was he wanted to create something he called even the United States of Europe, with him obviously at the head. And he damn well came close to doing so, conquering a lot of lands with just a energy unknown to mankind, which like this was like one of his greatest strengths is just he's constantly on the move. However, though he would face the English in some of these campaigns, he did not go through with going across the short little channel there to England and then fighting them because of the naval power there. But he hated the English. The English equally hated him. And so once he was able to amass all of this power and this land.
So I got a map to give you a chance to grab a drink, just for the scope of what Napoleon was able to accomplish. For those who aren't aware, and for those who are watching the video, this is the map of France during Napoleon's empire when he was emperor. So there are major portions of all of Europe that are effectively French controlled, and then there are the parts that aren't French controlled but are dependent on France. Like, it's a significant chunk of Europe at the time. Like, he was very successful in his ventures, whether it was to outright conquer or to create a dependent state from these other regions. So yeah, it was he definitely came very close to his goal of creating a United States of Europe type of thing.
Yeah, what's interesting is while he was sort of going about accomplishing all of this, it was maintained throughout England that Napoleon was most certainly the Antichrist. So, this was a common trope that was thrown about, and it's kind of an interesting attack because while he did, one thing we should mention about the revolution is completely anti-religious in all of it, all facets. But when Napoleon came to consulship, the emperor, he did not really reestablish the Catholic Church as the state church, but he allowed for the Catholic Church to sort of operate within his France, which was not something that the revolution was desiring.
Yeah, that's one of those things that in a period of time when the Catholic Church, Christianity as a whole, were really kind of a power behind a lot of throne type of a scenario, and had been through most of the monarchies throughout Europe up to this point. While Napoleon was Catholic, Napoleon wasn't exactly what you might consider a good Catholic. He viewed the church and Catholicism as a means to his ends, not as a guiding hand to what he should do with the power and how to use the power. Like you're talking about England considering him the Antichrist. The Catholic Church and then the Anglican Church were very hand in hand with the monarchs of England for a long time. Like, they kind of they were kind of two sides of the same coin in many ways, and that's how a lot of the monarchies, a lot of the ruling class was throughout Europe. And Napoleon really did not respect the church to that end. He respected the church for its influence and for what it meant to the average people, to the common folk, because he was, as you've mentioned before, like, a lot of what he was doing was for the betterment of the common folk. But at the same time, like, he's not fully committed to that cause. He's still committed to his individual cause of creating this united empire, not creating a Roman Catholic European empire, but a Napoleonic empire where they serve a purpose.
Yeah, he was always respectful. Well, initially he was respectful to sort of Catholic customs. He never went to mass himself. He also, like when he was, I think it was one of the campaigns in Turkey, he went to a mosque and observed all the customs of Islam, of the Islamic religion there too. And so he was sort of this, like, again, referred to earlier. He was a chameleon, and he played the role that he needed to play in any situation, right? He was eventually excommunicated from the Catholic Church, which caused him to capture and imprison the Pope for a time. He treated him fairly well, but this was not received very well by.
Imagine that.
And speaking of his relationship with sort of the Catholic states, one of the beginnings of his downfall was, though he already had Spain under his purview, he sort of got into this like proxy war over Portugal, and he wasn't met with so it says he's trying to go through Spain to get to Portugal, proxy war with England over Portugal. As he's trying to get to Portugal, Spain is not super acquiescing in helping him out. So even he essentially kind of goes to war with the people that he has placed already in power at Spain, which it gets him to naming one of his brothers as the king of Madrid. So he sort of wins, but doesn't win over necessarily the people of Spain. And so his popularity begins to sort of decrease there, if it was already even, like, I don't know how high it was at that point in time.
Yeah, I don't think Spain wasn't a controlled territory. It was considered a dependent territory. So it was already like he hadn't necessarily conquered Spain so much as he had brought Spain under his wing.
And even though Madrid then became a control, like not the rest of Spain was. And then he started to like put down the Inquisition and stuff, which was obviously not well received by the Catholic Church as well, or the Catholics of that time. But then this is sort of like normie historian land. Napoleon sort of had a friendly relationship with the Tsar of Russia, Alexander. However, Russia is also a giant landmass, and there are lots of advantages to be gained by controlling that landmass. And he has sort of a little falling out with, or he sort of felt like Alexander had slighted him in some ways. And so he embarks on a campaign into Russia. And it is low ball, like history telling to be like, well, if you go into Russia, then you're screwed. Like this is this is what's happened to so many people. And that's sort of true in this manner. However, Napoleon does begin his Russian campaign when the weather is nice. But as he's progressing his way through, sort of the Russian strategy is to engage in these little skirmishes and these small battles, but not like meet them on the grand battlefield and suck them in further into Russia. And as France is going through this going on this trajectory, they're burning down the villages and the towns that they're taking over, that they're sacking. They eventually get to Moscow, and it's later in the year. It's a long trek. And Napoleon, like, this is his goal, is like to take over Moscow, but he's essentially let in because Moscow has been deserted. And as he's in Moscow, the place is set aflame. The French, and I think this is actually what happened. The French contend that the Russians burned down their own city. I mean, the Russians obviously deny it, and they say that the French did this. However, it's a very anticlimactic campaign because he has Moscow, and now it's burning to the ground. And so they embark on their return to France as winter is about to heat up, freeze up. And here's where the army loses so many people as they try to trek back through Russia to France in the dead of winter. And as they're encountering these towns that they sacked on the way, they realize that they probably shouldn't have looted and burned them down because they have no reprieve. They have no place to stay and warm for a bit, and they lose many, many men on the way back. And back in Paris, as they're making their way back, there are rumors that Napoleon has died, and so they quickly start to set up a provisional government. And Napoleon hears of this, and he's upset because he's like, well, I have a he is married to he divorces Josephine and is married to the Austrian king's daughter, Marie Louise, before this campaign, and they do have a son together. This is a political arrangement, but he's sad to hear that they're setting a provisional government in this false news that he's died, as opposed to shouting "Long live the King of Rome," which is what he names his son when he's born. So he's in a salty mood when he returns to Paris. And obviously they're in a salty mood. France is in a salty mood because he's embarked on this campaign that lost them many men and didn't really gain them a whole lot in the ultimate run of things. And there's sort of a growing wariness of just constant war. But Napoleon regathers the army and sort of goes on this publicity stunt throughout France to garner support for another campaign into Russia. This time he's not going to fail. And he eventually amasses a pretty grand army again. And is going to start on another campaign into Russia. But the allies against France at this time, led by the English, are sort of combining their forces, and they meet. They amass more men than Napoleon is able to, and they meet in some conflicts, and eventually Napoleon sort of loses one, and the allies kind of take over or reach Paris, and they have essentially captured the emperor, right, of France, and they're determining what to do with him, and they don't have a desire to sort of enact their own coup or take over France as their own. So they initially offer for France to go back to the boundaries that it was at the time of the revolution. And Napoleon denies this, which he probably in retrospect should have accepted, because eventually he's then exiled to Elba, and the monarchy is reestablished for the French people with King Louis the 18th, I believe.
So there's some parallels that we can kind of look at between our last conversation about a historical figure with Nixon and with Napoleon. Like towards the end, as we're seeing it And as we had talked about with Nixon, Nixon starts to get paranoid. Like he starts to feel like everybody's kind of out to get him. He makes some what could be, in hindsight, looked at as irrational decisions with the way he did certain things and handled certain things. You see that with Napoleon as well, with the rumors of his death, with just kind of everything that's going on in Paris as he's out, on these campaigns that are not particularly popular. There is opposition being built towards him, and as he's learning about that, he starts to make some questionable decisions that probably, in his mind, he's trying to protect his own legacy. He's trying to do what he thinks is right, but it ends up giving him a bad reputation that carries on into history, which is why we kind of want to talk about these figures. Like, they're remembered for their worst moments, but there was a lot of that, like the early part of the Nixon years. There was a lot of the early part of Napoleon's rise to power and stuff that it was really rooted in like good stuff, and then they're kind of undone by their own ghosts to a certain extent. But the ghosts are created by things happen outside of their control that they don't necessarily respond to them particularly well. These are history lessons for those who are paying attention to things that have happened and things that are currently happening, as like, when shifts in power occur, how you handle it is possibly more important than the thing that happens itself.
Yeah, when he embarked on that first Russian campaign, he said to one of his aides that he did not know what he was getting himself into, but was intrigued to find out, or something like that. It's like he's reached the point of time where he's sort of bored and doing shit just to do shit, kind of. Like, it's not that simple, but in some regard it is. Yeah, when he gets to Saint Elba, this island, he's actually allowed like 400 men and some servants, and he's allowed to like set up his own government there. Which, like, as soon as he I should say, as he's going through France, leading to the boat to bring him to Saint Elba, he is met with some animosity by these people who formerly loved him, right? People who used to shout, "Long live the emperor!" And they're like, "Well, look what you did. You killed off a bunch of our men, and for nothing." Was sort of a sentiment he got as he was leaving France. He gets to Saint Elba, and he uses the men he's got, and then he's able to develop relationships with the natives there, and he sets up his own like little government, and like immediately gets to work, and he earns the respect of the natives there, which is kind of funny. Like, hey, we're sending you this former emperor, and the natives are like, okay, yeah, we can't wait. We'll listen to everything he says, which kind of, I mean, maybe it wasn't that simple, but the books I've read, they're all for it.
And again, this is a good parallel between different historical figures. Like when you look at Nixon was wildly popular, very in his own regards, a charismatic, incredibly intelligent, natural leader type, and that's like to be deposed to an island and more or less receive full fanfare upon arrival and get to just set up shop and do whatever you want and kind of become emperor of your own little island. That, like, just average people don't do that kind of thing. Like, there is something to be said for the type of leader that Napoleon was to be able to do that. And also, he still had a loyal following in Paris and in France that wasn't necessarily on board with all of this, which leads to probably where you're going with the next part of this, where he leaves Saint Elba.
Which is honestly one of my favorite things about Napoleon. Obviously, he's not content with this little island, and people are visiting him, telling him that he is missed in France. And even the folks who sort of excoriated him, or the sentiment that excoriated him as he was leaving France, has changed their mind because this reestablished monarchy is not going well. And of course, the French people are just as fickle as all get out anyways. Like, they can hate you one day and then love you the next, even hourly basis. So
I promise Mark's not going to die midstream.
I'm so sorry. There is he has this desire to give it one last go. There's also a theory that part of the reason he decides to give it one last go is he does hear that they are planning on sending him eventually, or taking him off the island of Elba and sending him to St. Helena, which is where he does end up eventually going. And St. Helena is no Elba when it comes to an island. It is off the southern coast of Africa. It's basically a rock. The climate is not nice, shall we say, especially for someone who has lived most of his life in France. So he takes his 400 men. They kind of float off the coast of Elba discreetly, not as like some grand army coming into France. More like a bunch of fishing boats going off to do a nice little fishing trip. They arrive on France. He starts making his trek through. Obviously, word is received that Napoleon has arrived eventually. And he eventually encounters a pretty large amount of his former men there to prevent him from progressing any further. And they've been charged with shooting him on sight, which is not what they do. And as they're having this little standoff, he's basically like, I'm here. Your former emperor, shoot me or join me. And they join him.
Again, a testament to the leader that he is. Like, they have standing orders to shoot him, and he's like, fucking do it. It's up to you.
Here I am.
And they decide not to, and to join back up with him.
And so he continues his trek. They amass more troops as he's making his way towards Paris. And as he's like pretty close to Paris, some Napoleon sympathizer in the city like starts handing out this pamphlet that says, "No more men are needed, King Louis. Napoleon has enough now," as if Louis has been sending these men to Napoleon. Louis is pathetic. So when Napoleon arrives in Paris, he basically just leaves. It's so messed up. He's like, peace out. And
it's all you, buddy. I'm out.
Napoleon immediately gets to work on setting up another provisional government, working on a new constitution. Obviously, the allies of Europe, which squashed Napoleon a year before, won't stand for this. So they converge again and are coming for Paris. So Napoleon, ever the launcher to get into a battle, was like, well, I'll meet them first. As we kind of went over, there is a wariness for war. And so I think he does have his army, but the will isn't really there. They do engage in some battles that he's sort of able to stave off the allies for a bit, until he meets up with, after one of his victories, he makes a mistake that old Napoleon never would have made. in which he waits too long to act after one victory. He actually, like they say, he slept in the next day, and sort of allowed a recuperation of of the Polish and the English armies, which is something that wouldn't have happened if Napoleon was ever on the move, just taking advantage of every opportunity. But here he kind of stalled a bit, and he meets the English at Waterloo, where the Duke of Wellington eventually takes out Napoleon and his army.
So I guess the big point of having the Napoleon conversation, similar to the point of having the Nixon conversation, is history tends to paint Napoleon just based off of the losses and the end and what happened, and you don't get a lot of you don't see or hear a lot of how popular, how smart, how good of a leader type that Nixon was up to that point. You don't hear a lot of how much of the like pleb support that Napoleon had in his early rise. That, you know, it was kind of built and founded on a good idea and principle, but Napoleon might have been a little too big for his britches in some aspects of the way he approached it, and made decisions and did things that took him down a wrong path or a bad path that led to the eventual end of the whole thing. But the early on part of it, how he got there, is a more engaging and a more telling story of who Napoleon was as a man, as a leader, as a ruler to some extent, than what the end of the story will tell, and what generally what the history books will end up telling you about Napoleon.
It would have been interesting to know how things would have gone had Napoleon's return from Elba sort of resulted in the Allies not being like, well, we can't have a loose Napoleon again, and being like, okay, we'll give him one more shot, but stop trying to conquer the world or something. And if Napoleon would have actually been content being, he expressed that he would have been content this second time around just being the King of France, as opposed to Emperor of the states of Europe. Probably not, though. I don't think that he ever.
It wasn't that was not in his DNA to sit still, to not fight, to not try to take power. That was not in his DNA. It's a fun daydream of what possibly could have been. But I think also probably the reason that the opposition was built the way it was against him coming back the second time is because they knew there's no way he's going to be content with this. He's going to get bored. He's going to want to expand his reach. He's going to see that there are opportunities to go and do something else other than sit here and just rule. So yeah, I mean, it could have been an interesting thing, but it probably would have eventually ended the same way, one way or the other.
Yeah, probably. It's interesting how he so when he loses at Waterloo and they're trying to decide what to do with him, he actually requests to go aboard an English ship. One of the thoughts that he had been having was eventually going to America, but he doesn't want to go to America for some reason. So he boards this English ship and eventually entraps himself. he thinks that he actually asks for them to be just gentlemanly and kind, just let them come aboard for a bit. And they're like, oh, yeah, sure. But of course, they have no intention of giving him up after he relinquishes himself in that way.
Again,
even while he's being held.
the charisma, like to just be like, yeah, I'm just gonna go on this ship and be like, all right, I'm here. Let's all be cool about this. Like that's just like it takes a special kind of human being to just have that level of charisma and self-confidence, and that's why he was as successful as he was up to a point, and also why he failed when he eventually did. Like that just unbridled self-confidence and charisma that we're just going to go do this, and I can do this because I'm going to do it. Like that's an amazing and also kind of a tragic end.
Yeah, it's just and so while he's being held on the ship, and it's off the border of Plymouth, England, he'll be walking back and forth on the ship's deck, and the English folks will come just to get a glimpse of this dude, and can't help to respect the guy that they've hated and feared for so long. So like, oh, there's the Antichrist in the flesh, and it's interesting. So now that he's like sort of their own caged animal, the man that they feared for so long is like, well, this is also a person, and we do sort of revere him for the things he accomplished, even if it was at our own expense. So they eventually send him to St. Helena, where he spends, I believe it's 5 or 6 years. Not allowed many like visitors, or not allowed to see his son. His wife, Mary Louise, really has nothing to do with him at this point in time. She didn't when he came back the first time from Elba. He dies alone on a rock that is an island, a volcanic rock. It takes only around 20 years. And so they bury him in Elba. In 20 years, the King of France requests that England give over the body of Napoleon, which they acquiesce. And so his body and casket is then brought to Paris, to the Invalids, where all of their military men are buried, or a lot of military men are buried. And he's given a grand, basically monument where his body or casket lays now. But that the return of his body is also like returns those emotions in France of longing for those days of Napoleon, because France is so fickle, and they're once again under the Bourbons, the Bourbon monarchy at this time. But then they go through another revolution shortly after this, where they're under another kingship. Napoleon's nephew is king for a little while in the mid 19th century, but he's not super popular himself. And his son dies at like 21 as a non-person, basically. But Napoleon wasn't really ever able to raise him, because he was exiled so shortly after he was born, and also he was on a Russian campaign after he was born as well. So part of it is his own fault. So there's no real heir to Napoleon.
Kind of an anticlimactic end, but I feel like we covered everything that I wanted to. I don't want to keep it too much longer.
No, you're good.
I
don't know. There are some one book like named the 3 foundations to Napoleon's like greatness were his self-obsession or his self-confidence, his energy, which we talked about a lot, opposing generals and just the soldiers he fought against. So that in the midst of war, it seemed like Napoleon was constantly at a different place, like simply moments after he was like at a place they had previously seen him. Like he was just constantly moving from one place to the other. They said that he had like he did not necessarily follow the conventions of war at the time. It's really into like surprise attacks or like strikes of quickness. So that speaks to his energy. And then the third, and then obviously his energy was also manifested in different ways, such as being named consul and immediately like getting to work and creating a new constitution within days, or just constantly working late into the night. He had a weird schedule sometimes where he would go to bed at 10 p.m., wake up at 2 a.m., work until 4 or 5 a.m., and then sleep again until like 10 or 11 a.m. But he had the ability, he named one of his special abilities, like just that he can like hit his bed, can hit his head can hit the pillow, and he can sleep for as long as he wants to and arise with no issue.
We share that in common.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like you. And the third foundation to his greatness was his imagination. And I think this is, him wanting to be emperor of the states of Europe is quite the imaginative goal. I think also people talk about how he seemed to be very like callous when it came to just thousands or millions of people dying under his watch. But it had like strong feelings towards like the dog of one of his soldiers like dying or like crying because his owner was dead, or he hated to see like animals suffer, even though like he would just send thousands to their death in many different battles. But I think he had a weird mind, and this plays a role in that because there's a story about how he wanted like an idea of the military situation in Belgium. And so he sent one of his officers to gather that information and then present it to him. And so when his officer did this, Napoleon like read over everything and was like, this all looks good, but I think you're missing 2 cannons in this specific city. It turns out he was exactly correct. And I think Napoleon's mind worked in like these like pictures where maybe he sort of forgot about the person, but he could think of all of the other details, which is what made him such a good general, because he knew the terrain, he knew how much cannon there was, where the infantry was located, all of the cavalry was located, all of this stuff, and how to best use this, what he was seeing in his mind to his advantage in these battles as they came to him quickly. He had to respond and react quickly.
And that, for the negative legacy of the end of Napoleon's rule and life, he still did leave a very influential legacy with military tactics and even some of his governing type stuff. Like, there are aspects of all of that get used throughout history after his death, and kind of shape the direction of warfare and politics moving forward for the next 100 years or so. So like for what he lacked, or maybe poor decision making that went on towards the end, he does have a very impressive legacy. And like, it's the great man thing. Like, great men rise up, and regardless of how it ends, there are going to be things that can be taken from it and can be used to understand history better, to understand the man better, to understand politics and everything else better. And Like a lot of that stuff, the reason we're doing this is, the history they didn't teach in school is because a lot of that stuff will get glossed over, and most of modern history classes will just focus on, him trying to conquer all of Europe and the march to Russia and eventually losing and everything else. But there was a lot that happened before that should not be discounted and can be learned from.
Yeah, he was a military genius. He was an opportunist, a great opportunist. He stated to a friend one time that he had no ambition, even though he appeared to be like one of the most ambitious people alive. And I think it was literally because I think it was so ingrained in him that he didn't really even think of it as ambition. It was more just, this is what I need to do.
Right. It was purpose, not ambition. Like this is his life's meaning, not some thing that he's striving for. This is the thing that he is meant for.
Yeah. I read this essay about him. It's kind of like briefly goes over facts that we've just gone over here, but it was written in 1914, and obviously 1914 is the beginning of the Great War, and France is not what France used to be at this war. Like we talk about, I mean, France is pretty heavily denigrated when it comes to the Second World War because they're like, yeah, we give up like right away. But France wasn't much better off in the First World War either. In this essay, this guy, the conclusion was like, for all of his faults, we could certainly use a Napoleon right now. And they definitely could. Although, like, there's that side, but the other side could also be that they were in the position they were in because Napoleon did sacrifice a lot of healthy young men that may have prevented them from being stronger once the Great War came around. So.
And without leaving a strong legacy and leaving France in a strong position at the end, that also kind of sets them up to be weak going forward. Like if he could have during his initial campaign as emperor, just consolidated power and made France and the surrounding territories that were in like the map that we looked at earlier, that were in that like French control. If he could have, kept that and made that a strong thing, France would be much better positioned throughout history. But the continuation of wars that just stretch their army thinner and thinner ad infinitum with no end in sight, it weakens them as a power in a way that they ultimately can't recover from. Could be a lesson for another government that likes to go to war at without end.
Yeah.
Not that they're involved in learning anything.
Yeah. I mentioned his brother, one of his brothers. He did have several brothers, and all of them were a part of his empire, all except for the one who actually helped him with that initial coup. He would name his brothers as kings of territories or of these other nations, but they had weird relationships where he honored his brothers and they honored him, but they also schemed and they bickered. And I mean, this has happened in other like hereditary monarchies too, though, or not hereditary, but like brother monarchies. So that's sort of to be expected. He also had aides and generals who would backstab him and betray him from time to time. Interestingly enough, you would think that like Napoleon, the person, was like, oh, he would never take back these folks who betray him or backstab him, but he constantly was forgiving these folks, which is an interesting quirk to his personality. I don't know if it's a positive or a negative. I guess it could be both. Caesar had this problem as well. So. Another
one of the great men will they will be loyal to a fault to the people who are loyal and have severe faults.
Yeah, and he considered honor to be the greatest sort of quality men can have. So I guess even disloyalty to even him was not the greatest sin. The greatest sin was for someone to act or behave dishonorable. Even when like aides would come to him and tell him that folks were talking poorly behind his back, or these certain pamphlets were going around about him and expressing negative sentiment towards him, he was like, well, there were times where he'd be like, well, they need to express themselves. And what better way to just sort of express themselves verbally against me as opposed to, I guess, physically or whatever. So he kind of allowed himself to be denigrated at times, but there were also times where he would like suppress bad like books that were written about him and painted him in a negative light naturally. I think that I'm giving as much as I can about Napoleon right now. I don't know if there are any other questions.
You covered more than I was. You covered more than I was expecting you to, given your current state of health.
There was something that popped in my head as I was talking, but now it's just whoosh, it's gone. So
I appreciate you soldiering through. Napoleon would have appreciated it as well, I'm sure. We will get back together at a later date and talk about another one of these topics. What do you want to do next? You brought up Caesar, and Caesar and Rome, especially Julius Caesar's rise to power, taking of power, and then his downfall, but the creation of the Roman Empire and what that kind of leads to. That's an interesting piece of time that also has a lot of parallels to what we're seeing in modern times. I've said it a number of times. I started telling my dad when I was like junior in high school, like I feel like we are living through and witnessing the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire, with the corruption of government, like just kind of the degeneration of our political figures. Like you saw a lot of similarities in how the direction the government went for Rome leading up to the end of the Republic, as you see right now. And I thought 20 years ago that we were like 70 years away from possibly seeing the collapse of the modern Roman Empire. And now 20 years later, I think I might have had the timeline doubled. Like I would be surprised if this American Republic lasted more than another 10 years. And I think technology.
So do you think it's the decline of the Republic or the Empire?
The Republic. I think it's the decline of the Republic. And that was something that James Gentleman and I touched on briefly, which also makes me want to carve out some time to sit down and look at the decline and fall of the Roman Republic, because I do think it really parallels a lot of what we're seeing right now. So maybe here in a couple months when you're fully healthy and we both got some time, we'll sit down and we'll dig into the fall of the Roman Republic. In the meantime, for those of you who may not have anything else going on, I am actually off work for all 4 days of the DNC convention in Chicago next week. So Monday night, I will be streaming, kind of doing a live viewing of the convention on this channel. And then Thursday night, when Kamala Harris accepts her nomination as the Democratic presidential candidate, maybe we'll be doing live streaming of that on the Peddling Fiction channel, and then probably Tuesday, Wednesday, depending on what the lineups look like, we may be watching some of that on the Morning After channel. So for those who don't have anything else going on next week, I plan on doing some coverage of the DNC. I would have liked to have done the RNC as well, but as personal situations worked out, I had some. I was supposed to work, and then I unexpectedly didn't have to work, so I packed up my kids and went home to visit with my parents, and I was out of pocket for that. Although it was fun to watch that stuff with my dad and get his takes on stuff and kind of see how the boomers feel about the RNC. That was entertaining, but I didn't get a chance to like stream it and cover it when it was happening. But I will definitely be covering the DNC next week. And Mark, if you're feeling up to it, you're more than welcome to hop in. And
I don't know if I can bring myself to watch any of that stuff, but
Monday night, Biden is supposed to talk. Will Biden actually be I want to see, will Biden actually be at the DNC, or will it be like his last address from the White House, similar type of situation where he's reading from a teleprompter that's over there for some reason instead of getting him lined up with the camera. So Biden's supposed to talk on Monday, and the Clintons are also supposed to be talking on Monday. So I thought that would be an interesting night to cover with all of that going on. And then, like I said, Thursday night for sure with the presumptive acceptance of the nomination by Kamala Harris. So that's what I got going on.
No, go ahead.
That's what I got going on for stuff I'll be doing here coming up.
Obama really is in charge when the Clintons are relegated to the first day of the DNC.
And the Obamas are supposed to be up on Tuesday. So see how that goes. Yeah, that's why I was saying either Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on the lineups, would more likely than not Tuesday, because I really just don't have a single solitary fuck to give about what Tim Walz has to say on Wednesday night. Even if they fill out the Wednesday night docket with other entertaining characters, I think the Obamas on Tuesday night will be more interesting to tune in for. So yeah, DNC coverage next week for anybody who is just an absolute glutton for punishment and feeling extra masochistic. Mark, speaking of masochistic, thank you for sticking it out for this long. I appreciate everything. I think we covered Napoleon great. Hopefully those.
Yeah, I apologize for sounding like RFK Jr. throughout the whole thing, but
it's all right. You did a good job. I tried to give you some relief here and there where I was able. But yeah, hopefully for those who were watching, listening, you got something out of it. You learned a little bit, or at least maybe have a different understanding and appreciation for Napoleon and the Napoleonic era when he was, his rise and fall and all of that. If there are other historical topics that you want to hear us talk about, feel free to hit me up on Facebook or X or just wherever else you can find me. Let me know what you think would be an interesting topic, and we'll see what we can come up with. Mark,
Thank you.
Go get healthy.
Thank you.
Later.
See you.